Last month it was revealed that Dying Light, the parkour survival game from Polish studio Techland, was set to receive a conversion for Nintendo Switch. But knowing the size and scope of this game, we were certainly curious to see how it would turn out. Well, the day has arrived, and we've spent the last few days playing through the game on Switch, and have some thoughts to share. Now, despite its age, Dying Light makes for a unique challenge on hardware such as Nintendo Switch. The game features a massive, complex open-world city to explore with a focus on granular detail, the exact type of game that isn't exactly well suited to mobile hardware. Beyond that, in its original form on PS4 and Xbox One, the game runs at 30 frames per second, which kinda makes this port on par with the likes of The Witcher 3 in terms of challenge, I'd imagine. So the big question is then, how does it stand up against that original console release, and what was compromised to reach the objective? We'll examine this and more today while directly comparing against the best console version of the game on PlayStation 4. We'll also discuss the frame rate and image quality, so let's get into it. At its core, Dying Light has the player moving around through a huge city dealing with hordes of zombies as the time of day changes dynamically. Powered by the final iteration of Chrome Engine, a name referencing the 2003 shooter of the same name, there's a lot going on in this game. It was extremely impressive at the time of release, and really it still manages to look great even by today's standards. The Switch version then includes a boatload of content, including the DLC packs and extra gear, making this sort of a complete version, at least content-wise. Technically though, it's clear that changes would have to be made, but this is precisely why I find Switch videos so fascinating to make. The Switch is underpowered hardware compared to every other platform on the market today. This is determined by its age and portable nature. It's one of the few platforms that still calls to mind the old days of porting, like bringing Quake or Quake 2 to a mid-90s console, something that really shouldn't have been possible. It's not quite that extreme, of course, but it's still interesting to see, and as you've no doubt noticed, sacrifices were indeed made. So, first things first, Dying Light for Switch is based on version 1.43 of the original game, and brings with it most of the key visual features, along with some interesting changes. Dying Light relies on deferred rendering, it should be noted. Now, this was especially common at the time of release, but it does have some drawbacks, including performance implications on mobile hardware. All those buffers and passes put a strain on memory bandwidth and other aspects of such hardware. Despite this challenge, the Switch port looks pretty good. The first thing I noticed is that Techland seems to be using some sort of new TAAU feature, Temporal Anti-Aliasing with Upscaling. The idea here is to sort of reconstruct the image from several different frames to match the target output resolution, either 1080p in docked or 720p in portable. Naturally, the actual base rendering resolution is lower than this, often counting below 720p in docked mode, but the results are interesting. It actually does manage to look reasonably native resolution when standing still, but as you move, you do start to notice some image breakup. Knowing that Dying Light runs at sub 1080p on Xbox One though, it's pretty clear that there's no way that they could have delivered a native 1080p on Switch hardware, so this approach actually makes a lot of sense. And this really hits home when you bring in the PlayStation 4 version for comparison. As you can see, it is surprisingly comparable. There's some breakup and depth of field appears shallower due to the lower base resolution, but fundamentally, it looks like Dying Light. Usually when comparing Switch ports to other more powerful machines, the resulting image is extremely blurry and very obviously much lower resolution, but with Dying Light, it holds up reasonably well, much more so than usual in fact. Now, once that initial cutscene here ends, the first sacrifice becomes more evident. Shadow resolution is reduced significantly. This is something that will become more noticeable out in the open world, but it seems like a pretty typical cut for lower powered hardware. Alright, so let's move on to the next area then, and another cutscene. Here you'll notice another change. Texture resolution has been pared back, which again, makes sense given the target platform and its memory limitations. This applies to characters and world textures alike. Now, to be fair, during normal gameplay, the textures do still manage to look pretty darn good. It's only when you push your face up against them that you really start to notice a difference. Still though, lighting, depth of field, and all that are intact here, and it does look good on the Switch. It's still very much Dying Light. This also reveals that the ambient occlusion has been changed. It's still there on Switch, but toned down, and looks a lot better than it did back on PlayStation 4, where you have these ugly halos around characters even when they're standing far away from a surface. Now as we make our way to the roof, you should note another change. The per pixel motion blur used on prior versions of the game has been eliminated. This is a shame, I feel, as motion blur helped smooth out the visuals when running at a lower frame rate. But of course, this effect does not come free, so as we saw with Doom Eternal on Switch, I can kind of understand why the cut was made, even if it's disappointing. Now, once you stop though, you'll note the limitations of TAAU. There is a slight unsteadiness to the image versus the PS4 version, owing to the lower base resolution, but despite that, it is still surprisingly effective, and it does seem to be higher resolution than you would expect. So yeah, all this early game stuff is really rather comparable, from climbing across the crane here, which looks extremely similar, to the cutscene that follows, to the strong depth of field and post-processing effects used here after completing the challenge. It's all really well done. But obviously, the real test comes from exploring the city, and this is where things start to get more interesting. Now, as this cutscene comes to an end, the sacrifices start to come into focus. Basically, all distance detail has been toned down on Switch. Objects are called and use lower detail LODs, shadows are reduced or cut at a distance, and overall texture clarity, as mentioned earlier, is lower. In other scenes, you'll note that dynamic lights are also called from view and only appear as you approach them. The thing is, these cuts were clearly necessary and kind of expected, but despite them, I actually think it holds up pretty well, especially when playing in portable mode where the flaws become less obvious. The whole thing manages to look and feel like Dying Light on a very low-powered device, which, yeah, it's pretty impressive to behold. So let's look at a few other areas around the city then. Such as this area. As noted earlier, the reduction in shadow quality is extremely evident, and there is some additional image instability, but I'm still rather impressed with how comparable this is to the PlayStation 4 version. It's still relatively sharp, and most of the scene composition is intact. Water rendering, then, is also reduced in terms of overall fidelity, but the effect itself and the rippling of the area beneath the water surface does remain intact. The zombie hanging out over on the left, though, does reveal that animation rate can be reduced for zombies far enough away from the camera, though here in this scene, they do update at a normal rate, which is to say you won't notice this too often, but it does crop up from time to time. And again, the rest of this scene is also remarkably similar, but the reduction in texture fidelity is certainly noticeable. Reflections then seem to be pared back in certain instances, such as this puddle here, but they are present in other places. Moving on, the grass shadows are also removed from patches of foliage like this. During my comparisons, I did note that in certain areas there seemed to be a reduced number of zombies, like this. But after playing more, I think it's actually more down to randomized placement. For instance, during this early mission, when you need to distract the zombies using firecrackers, there's still plenty of them on screen. And of course, if we jump over to the following DLC, there's still plenty of them out here wandering around in the field. But in some areas like this, I just noticed fewer of them overall. Then there's this area where we're perched upon this ledge looking back out over the street. And yeah, there's fewer zombies in this scene, but again, this is due to the randomization of their placement. Otherwise, it's very comparable. It's sometimes easy to focus on the missing elements above all else, but it is important to note holistically how close they get in other areas. That said, in another instance, Object Poppin' rears its head, and yeah, this is something you'll spot throughout the game as well. I feel like these comparisons should give you a pretty good idea by now about the cuts made, and it somehow feels different than certain other Switch conversions we've tested in the past. The general approach here seems to have been to scale back overall environment complexity, reduce the distance in which objects are drawn in, reduce shadow quality, and other things like that, but it still preserves the overall look of the game, and it has a certain clarity to it that we don't usually see with ports like this on Switch. The thing is, all of the rest of the features and gameplay complexities are well preserved, which is key, and things like loading times are actually improved. This is the loading you'll face when exiting the tower, one of the few loading points during normal play, and yeah, surprisingly, it actually manages to load faster on the Switch, which kinda surprised me to be honest. Of note, this was installed to the internal storage of the OLED Switch for testing. On PS4, I used the default internal hard drive. So yeah, it's obvious that the Switch port does not match the prior console release in terms of overall visual complexity, but that's kind of expected here. The cuts made all seem relatively smart given the constraints of the game itself. It's clear that this must have been a very technically challenging conversion to pull off. It's a game doing things the Switch isn't really well suited to, but it does manage to work pretty well. It is interesting that in contrast, the sequel, Dying Light 2, has been announced as coming to Switch via streaming. I think it's pretty clear that that game, with its significantly more advanced visuals, could never have run natively on the Switch. But I'm glad they didn't actually rely on this for the original game, and instead opted to convert it as we have here. They could very easily have taken the approach that Square Enix is with Kingdom Hearts and just went for a cloud version of Dying Light, but this is a proper conversion of the game that runs natively on the hardware. I like that. On top of this, it all looks really good on the Switch OLED, with its vibrant colors and rich contrast. It's genuinely impressive to see. And in fact, playing in portable mode on such a machine is probably the best way to experience the Switch version since the artifacts are less noticeable. But this brings us to performance, and the results here are rather interesting. So if you've been watching this video closely, you've probably noticed that there's some instability in the general camera motion. That is, the game doesn't look especially smooth in action as it does on PlayStation 4. There's a good reason for this, but it's not what you might have guessed. You see, Dying Light Switch actually does a remarkable job at keeping the frame rate from dipping below 30 frames per second. It's kind of surprising given the nature of this game. That's not to say it does not dip below 30 frames per second, that certainly happens as well. But there's another problem instead. The frame rate likes to jump above 30 frames per second. In fact, during normal gameplay, it often bounces between 30 and 36 frames per second, with vertical sync engaged, of course. Now, on paper, this may not seem like a big deal, but what's happening here is that we're basically seeing a bunch of 16 millisecond frame time spikes alongside the typical 33 millisecond frame times, and this results in inconsistent motion, similar to incorrect frame pacing, but slightly different in how it manifests. It creates a slightly jerky look to the action. The good news here, however, is that the frame rate does stay above 30 FPS most of the time, and after raising this issue with the developers, I was informed that they are looking to solve the problem with a patch. If it were dipping below 30 often, then it's clear the issue would be significantly more difficult to solve, but in this case, it's really just about stabilizing it to enable consistent frame delivery. This is something I'll keep an eye on. The primary exception where the frame rate can slip under 30 FPS tends to occur at night. Perhaps the shadow casting flashlight and the increased activity of enemies has an impact on it, but it does seem to occur especially in this specific area of the city. But like I said, the performance is otherwise good, so if they can fix the frame rate cap, you should get a very smooth 30 FPS experience here. And if they can manage to bring back in the motion blur, it'll look even better. It's also worth noting that I tested the introduction scene to The Following, which is one of the big first add-ons for the game, and this one presents a very different environment from the rest of Dying Light in that it's mostly these open outdoor areas with rolling hills, lots of foliage and the like, and in fact here we actually see huge hordes of zombies, and well, the performance is pretty much on par with what we saw in the city. There are some dips below 30 of course, but by and large it's still that same 30 to 36 frames per second issue that I've been talking about here. One last critique though I want to present is the audio. I've been talking about this more often in my videos, and unfortunately this is another Switch game which does not offer surround sound support. Everything seems to play out in 2.0 stereo using the left and right channels. Alas, this is something I've noticed becoming increasingly common in the Switch world. It may be about saving resources, but it is slightly disappointing as someone that plays with the surround sound system. That said, the game does play best in portable mode where you're likely to be using headphones or just the internal speakers, both of which are stereo. So that makes this port rather interesting then. If you break down each of the individual aspects and look at them in isolation, there's a lot of critiques to be had. but I'm still utterly fascinated by what was done here. But holistically, this is a rather impressive version of Dying Light considering the hardware. It's utterly fascinating to see a game like this running natively on underpowered mobile hardware. And when you're just playing the game and not making these comparisons, especially in portable mode, it really looks pretty darn good, I have to say. But it's tricky now because we're reaching this period where next generation consoles or current gen have been on the market now for about a year. We're becoming used to this sort of new level of performance, but the Switch is of course still below that of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, owing to its portable nature. It's also interesting because this video arrived shortly after it was announced that Dying Light would also receive a next-gen patch, which upgrades things like the frame rate to 60 FPS and, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what else. So when looking across the whole spectrum of different versions of this game, obviously the Switch version is going to be the least visually impressive, but considering what it took to get it to run, I do still think it's quite a worthy port. It's pretty much for people that play primarily on the Switch or want a portable version of the game. And it will absolutely deliver that if that's what you're looking for. And I do still think it's worth replaying. I didn't have time to play through the whole game or anything like that, but I was quickly reminded of why Dying Light itself is so interesting. The mechanics for traversal are fun and unique, and the nighttime mechanic with the stronger zombies is also pretty intense. The game manages to not fall prey to some of the more typical open world issues that we're so familiar with today. It kind of excites me more for the sequel, which is scheduled to come out next February. But that's pretty much all from me for now. Like I said, the Switch version is very impressive for the platform, but obviously there are drawbacks, and hopefully you have a better idea of what those drawbacks are by now. And if you enjoyed this video, of course, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff. And we'll see you next time.